Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun. Today we have episode 3 of Philosophy with Jigmo. Today's subject is going to be an introduction to Aristotle, which I'm very much looking forward to. Before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on both YouTube and BitChute, where you can find over 160 uploaded episodes on theology, philosophy, conspiracy theories, and politics, and anything else you can imagine. You can also find all of that in the RT podcast channel of the Roundtable Discord server, where we record this podcast every single day. So make sure you join us here. That being said, welcome, Mr. Jigmo. How are you, sir?
Very well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. I must admit, my knowledge of Aristotle is very limited, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot more today. So whenever you're ready, you can guide us through this introduction.
Great. I guess I should start off by briefly talking about why it is that I chose to talk about Aristotle. This is now my third episode of Philosophy with Jigmo, and I thought that it would be very malintentioned and irrational to do a whole series on philosophy without discussing probably the most influential name when it comes to Western philosophy over the last 2,000 years, and that's, of course, Aristotle. Well, it's actually the conjunction of Aristotle and Socrates/Plato, which is why I thought I would start off by kind of giving the basics of Plato's views, who was actually the teacher and the mentor of Aristotle. And against the backdrop of his views, I will voice Aristotle's opinions, his disagreements, and his grievances with his mentor, and the stuff they actually agreed on. And I think this will give us a relatively decent introduction to both Plato and then Aristotle, which are the two meatiest, biggest names in Western philosophy over the last 2,000 years. To start with Plato, it's important to talk about what it was that Plato wanted to achieve with his philosophy. Plato was at many points concerned with how to identify objects in the real world. One of his biggest worries was human beings go about and they experience a whole bunch of stuff. And they have this magical ability to sort their experiences into coherent categories. So, for example, if you see one cat here, another cat there, and yet another cat over there, you're able to group them into this category of catness, of cats, and make that a coherent part of your worldview. And he found that to be rather fascinating because cats come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are white, others are black, furry, no fur, small, big, missing a paw, without a tail. It really bothered him how it was that we recognize cats to be cats. And he had a fascinating solution. He actually believed that all cats participate in an ideal form of catness, which is located in something called the world of forms. The world of forms is a transcendental realm, which contains all these forms and is a place for souls where souls exist before they are entrapped in the human body. So in his view, every human being is actually in the world of forms at some point in their existence as a soul. And at some point, they are entrapped or embodied in an actual physical body in our world, in the physical realm. And this process of entrapment makes them forget all the knowledge they acquired in the world of forms. And the sort of knowledge they acquired in the world of forms was their interaction and their recognition, their partaking in the form. So his thought was that before you were born, up there in the world of forms, enjoying and celebrating and taking in the perfect ideal of catness. And then when you were brought to the physical realm, you actually forgot what catness was. And now you are trying to, via experience and reasoning, remember or recollect what catness is by encountering many cats and reasoning about what their essential nature is. So there's two parts to Plato's Metaphysical and Epistemology. On the metaphysics side, you have the world of forms, this transcendental realm. And on the epistemology side, you have a prenatal existence, so pre-birth existence in the world of forms, and then recollection throughout your life of the forms that you've forgotten because of entrapment or embodiment. Plato was a Platonic dualist. He believed that you are soul and body, and the soul is the more important part. The body is a sort of prison. And this has all sorts of fascinating repercussions for his views on death and his views on suicide. Against this backdrop, I'd like to now start talking about Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student for about 2 decades, 20 years. And he was, for most of those 20 years, largely in agreement with Plato on most stuff. It was only after Plato died and Aristotle left Athens that he started reevaluating his views and kind of building a world system of his own. And one thing that needs to be immediately said about Aristotle is that he did not believe in the world of forms, and he did not believe in the doctrine of recollection. He thought these were rather absurd concepts that were necessary to any coherent worldview. And he actually gives 4 separate arguments for why he rejects the world of forms. Argument 1 is that the world of forms is unparsimonious, which basically means that in modern terms, it's not in accordance with the principle of Occam or Occam's razor. His thinking is, listen, the original data we're trying to explain, how it is that we sort and understand the natural kinds around us, is what we're trying to explain. And here you, Plato, have added this whole extra transcendental world in order to explain something that I think I can explain without positing such a metaphysically exotic, heavy entity. And so he just genuinely believed that Plato's explanation was highly unparsimonious, which is an epistemic sin, so to speak. Argument 2, Aristotle was annoyed and irked by the term participation. Plato held that cats are cats because they somehow participate in the perfect form or ideal of catness in the world of forms. But one of the things that Aristotle notices throughout Plato's teachings is that Plato never actually discusses what participation is in detail. He gives some metaphors here and there, and he makes some analogies, but when asked to elaborate, he often leaves his questioners without an answer. And so Aristotle thought that participation, which was supposed to be this foundational guiding thing which motivates all of Plato's metaphysic, is left vague and unexplained, and he thought that was horrible. Argument 3, the forms are immutable. They're eternal. They do not change. Yet, as Aristotle observed at many points, the stuff around us does change. And so it's rather strange to say that the stuff around us is grounded in, is partaking in, and it is what it is because of something eternal and immutable, when it is changing and moving and forming and reforming at every second of its existence. So there's a rather strange disanalogy. And finally, argument 4, Plato's arguments lead us to some really strange forms. There's forms such as bigness and smallness, because the way Plato's forms are supposed to work is they're supposed to be identifiers for anything we can ourselves term in the real world. So if you can identify that that object is big and that object is big and that object is big, and you're able to unite them in a single concept of bigness, then that must mean that there's a form of bigness out in the world of forms. And this stuff kind of gets rather ridiculous, because if you can recognize that that man is bald and that man is bald and that man is bald, there must be a form of baldness and a form of blindness and even a form of not being something. So if you can recognize that your chair is in a cat and your computer is in a cat and your post-it note is in a cat, then do they all partake in a form of not catness? So Aristotle kind of takes issue with the fact that not that the forms have to be infinite, but with the fact that the forms get really strange. They end up predicating over stuff that is rather weird to predicate over, like lacks and insufficiencies. And so Aristotle, upon discarding the world of forms, also naturally discards the doctrine of recollection. He doesn't believe that you existed before you were born. He does not believe that you were sitting in a world of forms, partaking in these beautiful, eternal, immutable entities. He believes that the forms are actually in the beings themselves. So, and this is a very important point. People often read Aristotle as disagreeing with Plato about the existence of forms themselves. This is wrong. Aristotle, like Plato, was a realist about forms. He believed in forms as strongly as Plato. He just placed them in a different place, and he believed in he believed in a different epistemology, which is far from saying that he had a different ontological view when it came to forms themselves. I guess I kind of want to talk about, and naturally this means that Aristotle wasn't a Platonic dualist. So he did believe that human beings are soul and body, that they are part body and part soul, but he did not believe that the soul was the most important part. He believed that the soul and body both have an equal share in existence. And it is largely debated that he did not believe in an afterlife. He believed that the soul is unquestionably linked to the body, and when the body disappears and is destroyed, so is the soul. Now, he did not believe that forms are observable per se. He believed the forms are somehow instantiated in the creature, in the cat or in the table, whatever it is that we're assigning the kind to. But that is something I want to get in later. I want to talk about how it is that he believed that objects are formed, because I think this is absolutely essential to understanding Aristotle. For Aristotle, everything is hylomorphic, which means it's a combination of matter and form. Form is what gives the thing its nature, and matter is what individuates it as a member of a kind from another, which basically means that if you have a bunch of cats, they all have the form cadness, and they all share that form of cadness, and it is their matter, their individual fleshes, their individual bones, their individual spatio-temporal locations that individuates them from each other. He also believed that there can be a matter of matter. So to give an example, your table has the form of being a table. Its matter is wood. It is made of wood, but the wood is also a form which is made of further matter. So for example, wood, a bunch of, like, I guess in the modern age, wood can be made of different elements or different woods mixed into one. So he kind of believed in a hierarchy system where you have the most macro forms like tableness, and then forms of matter, and then forms of matter all the way down. And at the very foundation of reality, and I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of Aristotle, Aristotle believed that there was a formless prime matter which grounds everything. And what this basically means is that there is a fundamental matter which is unintelligible, because in his view, to understand something and to grasp something with your intellect, it means to understand its form. But the prime matter which underlies everything doesn't actually have a form. It is a pure matter that everything else is formed out of. I think, if I am not mistaken, he believed that above that prime matter, there were the four elements. I think this was a four-elemental view, which was probably very popular in Greece at the time. I don't have full knowledge of this, but he actually believed that there was this unintelligible, formless matter called prime matter that undergirded everything, which I think is a revolutionary. It's an absolutely incredible view. And my own suspicion is that in modern physics, you will actually find many people describing something along the lines of unintelligible, undescribable prime matter constituting the very foundation, the very ground of reality. I think whatever Aristotle was talking about might not be that far from what we will be ourselves saying in the modern age, if not now, very soon. What I kind of want to talk about is Aristotle and language. One of the contemporaries of Aristotle was Gorgias. Gorgias held that we cannot actually communicate with each other because all we have are words, and words are merely symbols. Now, both Plato and Aristotle disagreed with this, and Aristotle actually had a very strong view. He believed that natural language itself can be conventional. The symbols we use, the actual words we use, can be changed. The same word in French and German can mean the same thing, and the actual symbols of language you're using are, in fact, different. But the stuff they mean is the same. The stuff that these ideas represent in our minds is the same. And this is, I think, is one of the earliest examples of a philosopher bringing up propositions. Aristotle basically was talking about propositions, a likeness, a similarity that is shared between our minds, even though we use different symbols or we use the same symbols. And he believed that what grounds the efficacy of communication, what grounds the possibility of communication, is this shared understanding of what we're talking about, which sounds very commonsensical now that we understand what propositions are and how they're different from statements. But for many sophists at the time, of whom I think Gorgias was one, they didn't actually believe in anything like propositions. They thought that human communication at its core is dysfunctional, because we have no way of understanding each other beyond sameness of symbols. Aristotle genuinely believed that the symbols had more behind them, a shared meaning. And he talked about this meaning or these propositions as universals and particulars. That's something that is commonly brought up, where particulars are particulars of a kind and universals are the naturally predicated categories that are predicated of the members of the kind. And when we talk, we're able to understand what universals we're referring to because we have these universals in our mind. Here's one very fascinating part of Aristotle's thinking that I discovered. This is kind of a smaller part, but I think it's absolutely fascinating. Aristotle had a very funny view of propositions about the future. So one of the things that he discussed was, what does it mean when we say something about future events? So say, for example, I say, there is going to be a sea battle tomorrow. A question Aristotle was concerned with was whether this proposition, this statement, had a truth value. And he thought that there was actually reasons to think that propositions concerning the future don't have a truth value, because he thought that if they did, then the future events in question would have to occur by necessity. So if you say right now, there's going to be a sea battle tomorrow, Aristotle actually thought that if that proposition has truth value, for example, if it's true, then there must by necessity be a sea battle tomorrow. And if it's false, then there must by necessity not be a sea battle tomorrow. And the fascinating thing about that is he actually thought that was good enough reason to think that propositions about the future do not have a truth value. He actually wanted to say that any propositions about the future have no truth value in order to preserve A, free will, and two, chanciness and randomness, which seems so inherent in our world. He wanted to make sense of things happening by accident or things happening by human agenthood or human free will. And he thought that future propositions having a truth value was an obstacle to that. I personally think this view is incoherent. I think you can both hold that future propositions have a truth value and that things don't happen by necessity. But that's my own view, not Aristotle's. We could discuss that afterwards if you guys are so inclined. Another thing I really want to talk about is Aristotle's four causes, which I think is the last thing I want to fully discuss, because I think the four causes are an absolutely essential part. If you ever have a course on Aristotle, this is probably going to be the very first thing your teacher will discuss. In Aristotle's view, there are four causes for why something is the way it is. Cause one is matter, or what constitutes something. So let's use an example. Let's use a table. Let's go back to the table. Cause one, matter. For a table, it would be wood. Cause two was form, the form of the table that we discussed previously. His agreement with Plato. This would be tableness for the table. Cause three is the agent or efficient cause, or something that had to have taken place to bring the object into being. So for the table, this would be the carpenter. And cause four, the final cause, or the end or purpose, or the final destination, the telos of the object in question. And for something man-made like a table, this was to hold items or to function as a table, to be something that you can write on. Strangely enough, the four causes function differently for man-made things and for natural things. So for let's take a natural thing like a dog. Cause one for a dog would be flesh and bones. Cause two would be dogness, or canine nature, however you want to put that. So those are similar to the table. Cause three is where we kind of get into a very fascinating element. Cause three, which is agent or efficient cause for the dog, is the dog's parents. The dog's parents had to act in order to make the dog. Aristotle actually thought that every single thing which is natural had to have had an agent efficient cause which was alike or exactly the same as itself to pass on the form. So he believes that every single dog in the history of dogs has had doggy parents, which alludes to the fact, and I think he mentions this in several places. Aristotle actually believed that time is eternal. And if you, no matter how far back you go in time, the natural kinds that are instantiated currently don't change. Dogs are around, cats are around, and they're having sex and multiplying the way they are now, and largely on a large scale, which natural kinds are instantiated doesn't change. So Aristotle will actually find something like the principle of evolution, where species emerge spontaneously, ridiculous. He would think that it would be going against his third cause, the agent or efficient cause, which for natural kinds are their natural kind parents. And cause four, the final cause for Aristotle, was for natural kinds, as we're discussing them. For the dog, it was to be the best dog it can possibly be, to flourish as a dog, to actualize its potential as a dog, to fully realize its doggy nature. His belief was that every natural substance is striving as hard as it can to be the best version of itself it can be. And in this sense, Aristotle's universe is very theological, which means that it is very goal-oriented and purposive. All of nature is shot through with purposiveness. If you actually notice, three of the four causes in the natural or the matter side, or natural or the man-made side, are essentially form. Form plays basically a majority part in understanding the causal nature, the physical nature of anything around you, which is very, very different from a modern view, which doesn't attach so much of a theological purposive nature to everything. There is some other stuff that I wanted to talk about, which has to do with chance or luck, but I think that might be a little bit niche for this conversation. I already brought up the future propositions, but that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I think one takeaway from Aristotle is he does some absolutely revolutionary work. He is the first to, I think he's one of the first to discuss propositions and to discuss shared meaning. He's one of the first to identify that forms are in the objects themselves, kind of bringing science to earth instead of having to reason about a transcendental realm which we experienced before you were born. He endorses a principle of parsimony, which I think guides a lot of reasoning today. And on top of that, he has very religious attitudes, which quite frankly fuel a lot of Neoplatonic and Christian thought throughout the ages. If you look at any Christian philosopher beyond the 4th or 3rd century, you'll find them mentioning and referring to Aristotle as if he was a genius, and using a lot of his philosophy, a lot of the stuff I mentioned actually, as doctrines and as components of their own thinking and reasoning. So I think Aristotle is an absolutely fascinating figure. These are some of his doctrines, some of his principles and understandings. I hope that made sense. I hope that was somewhat informative, and you guys got something new out of that. I think I'd like to open the mic to the audience if you have any questions or comments or anything of the sort.
That was excellent, very interesting, very informative. Thank you so much. So I guess I'll ask you this question as a follow-up, as other people collect their thoughts. How relevant do you think Aristotle is in modern philosophy? Right? In the first podcast, we talked about modern philosophy and analytic philosophy. What do you think are his most enduring contributions? Is there anybody doing some kind of Aristotelian philosophy today, or is it mostly, in the history of the discipline?
I think what I want to say about Aristotle, with my own experience of modern philosophy, most of what Aristotle says and does has been updated and reformed to fit more modern criteria and more modern ways of talking and reasoning. But if there is one thing that Aristotle has, which even the modern folk are using, and it's actually coming back into popularity, and him and Plato share this, the very idea of forms, or the very idea of a shared nature which is real between things, is now becoming more and more popular. For a long period in the 20th century, people were becoming nominalists, which basically means they didn't actually believe that there was some real nature which was uniting all cats or tables or all chairs. They just believed that these were terms that we were assigning to things based on similarity, and these were actually very arbitrary and conventional. They didn't have any real meaning or any real value. Realism about natural kinds, or Platonism, as people call it, is becoming more and more popular now. And I think it wouldn't be becoming more and more popular now if it stayed in the Platonic form. If it stayed as a world of forms thing, where you have these removed, transcendental, immutable things which are somehow removed from physical reality, I think a lot of the stuff wouldn't be picking up steam now. I think Aristotle put Plato's Platonism, the realism about forms, into a far more palatable and plausible form, where he brought it down to the real physical level, discussing the objects themselves and not some transcendental realm. And I think that realism about forms and the real physical things around us is very much popular now. I know I'm a Platonic realist about a bunch of stuff. So yeah, I think there's something there.
What can you tell us about Aristotle's, personal life story? It's separate from, I guess, his ideas, and I apologize if I missed you covered any of this. But was there anything in terms of his actual biography that is notable? I know you're talking about whole life here, but do we know much about his actual life historically, and was it of interest aside from his ideas?
Um, how I did research for this presentation was I have a professor who I TA for, who does presentations on Aristotle, and I took notes and I studied up her presentations and did some independent work. I didn't get a chance to look into Aristotle's personal life, but I want to mention this. There's a certain political dichotomy between Plato and Aristotle, where I think Plato was, for personal reasons, more in favor of a non-democratic or meritocratic, or I think it was like an epistemically based meritocracy, or an some term combining meritocracy and epistemology. That was Plato's view, and I think Aristotle was I may be completely mistaken. This is, you guys should look into this on your own if you're interested. I think Aristotle was opposing Plato's views, Plato's political views, and was far more egalitarian or democratically minded, if that makes any sense. That's really the only thing I know about Aristotle as a personal figure. I don't know much about his lifestyle. I apologize. I kind of focused on the philosophy.
No problem. It was somewhat of an unfair question, and it's somewhat irrelevant to what we're talking about. Does anyone?
No, I think it's fascinating.
Does anyone else have a question about Aristotle, his philosophy, or any of what you've heard?
So you mentioned something about he must be confused about certain things. Could you go deeper into that, or could you emphasize on that?
Yeah, when I was talking about propositions about the future, I said that Aristotle was mistaken about a proposition having truth value if it regards the future, entailing that the future event is the future event must happen out of necessity. And let me explain that. My own view is that it could be true today that you're going to do something tomorrow, but it could very well be true that you're going to do it tomorrow freely. So I think Aristotle is careless. I think he thinks that the truth value implies that you are causally or physically necessitated to do the thing in question tomorrow. So let me give you an example. Let's say right now it's true that tomorrow you'll get up and have cereal for breakfast. I think it's fully compatible with your having cereal tomorrow breakfast freely, that this proposition have true value. Because I think it can be true that you're going to have cereal tomorrow for breakfast freely, while it is true now that you're going to have cereal tomorrow freely. And the way that works is that's a logical necessitation. It is true that the proposition being true now, it's in some way logically necessitates that you do this thing tomorrow. But the necessitation that we care about for free will generally is a sort of physical or causal necessitation. There's nothing forcing you or imposing on you to eat the cereal tomorrow morning. It's just a logical structural fact that you're going to have cereal tomorrow morning if that's the case. So I think Aristotle makes a mistake that, quite frankly, people make for a very long time. I think until Anselm, or I think Anselm, yeah, he confuses logical necessitation or structural necessitation with causal or physical necessitation, and I think those two are very different. And I don't blame him, because that's like centuries ahead. And I've had the luck of reading about this stuff, so I'm no genius for proving him wrong there. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I'm willing to elaborate. Let me know. I'll take the silence as a yes.
So there was a lot covered there, and I'll need to re-listen to it to retain it a little better. Your pacing was good, but the information went by quickly, and there was a lot of it, so I'm trying to grasp onto what I can follow up on. So Aristotle's surely not his only, but one of his primary contributions was providing an alternative to Plato's forms, right? Or idealism, right? Can you, I apologize if this is repeating yourself, but can you just give me one more of his major contributions in addition to that stands out in the history of philosophy?
Sure. What I take to be the principal importance of Aristotle is his rejection of Plato's unparsimonious metaphysic, which is Plato's world of the forms. Aristotle understood that you could be a realist about forms. You could believe in true natural kinds which relate all entities to each other, all cats to a single catness, without believing that the catness is somehow in a transcendental realm. You can actually put the catness in the cats themselves, and you could even put in the catness in our language, in our understanding. He has this thing called passive and active intellect, which I didn't go into, but that's an unrelated issue. But I guess the main thing is, it's this simpling down of a very, very important thing that makes Aristotle principle. And we could do a whole podcast or a whole 2-hour conversation on why Occam's razor or simplicity principle matters. But generally in philosophy, if there is some really useful doctrine or some very useful principle, and somebody comes and says, here's a simpler way to achieve the same things that this thing achieves, that is a major step forward. So to retain Plato's metaphysic, or to retain Plato's ontology, which is the forms, while getting rid of the world of forms and the principle of recollection, which is very awkward, which basically says that people exist before they're born in a material realm where they are getting acquainted with the forms, and then when they drop down, they forget about the forms and they're recollecting them. And it sounds coherent. I mean, it's not like there's a logical contradiction, but it just sounds so long-winded and so exotic and complicated. A more naturalized epistemology and a more naturalized metaphysic are enormous achievements for the time, which I think make Aristotle very important. And I think his approach to all of this from a biologist's point of view, I think Aristotle was primarily a biologist, so he was very concerned with natural kinds and with explaining why natural things are the way they are. His principle of 4 causes, of understanding animals in terms of their parents, their final causes, and what they're made of, their matter, their flesh, are basically precursors to systematized, well-developed science. I mean, he set the roots for the scientific method and for a worldly understanding of the physical realm. And I think the importance of that cannot be overstated. Does that make sense? Does that help a little bit?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry if I talk fast when I do this. I'm kind of chasing my own thoughts, and I implore you, Shogun, especially if I'm getting really quick in mid my presentation, feel free to stop me and be like, you're going a bit fast, slow down. I think that would help me a lot.
Sure thing. No, your pacing was good. I guess simply because it's information dense material. And I know this from my time in academics, right? It's almost always better to slow down a little bit consciously, because the unconscious tendency is to speed up. But
Yep.
that being said, your pacing was good. The presentation was great. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Jigmo? I guess I'll just ask you general questions then, if I can.
Yep.
I mean, again, aside from what you've said so far, what would you say is your favorite part of Aristotle's philosophy or his ideas? Or to put it another way, is there a way that this has influenced your own thinking as you're doing your work with philosophy now in contemporary academia? Do you ever find yourself utilizing Aristotelian ideas, or do you think it's informed your thinking in some ways personally?
Yeah, I remember that my introduction into metaphysics was J. Lew's. There's a guy, J. Lew, Lous, Introduction to Metaphysics. And I remember reading about nominalism versus realism, which is basically this debate of, is there a real united nature that things participate in that are the same? Is there a real catness among the cats, or are cats just an arbitrary category that we assign to these things that just look the same? And kind of a story that's always stuck with me is one that I heard in Aristotle class. I'm not sure if this is Aristotle's example, but this is something my professor came up with. She talked about this. Imagine how implausible it would be if aliens were to come down and sort things not by the sort of similarities that we sort them by now, like not sort like cats because they partake in some real nature, which is catness, but sort things based on color. So all the yellow things go into this category, all the green things go into this category, and all the red things go into this category. So these aliens wouldn't have terms for horses and cats and tables. They would just have terms for red things, blue things, green things, maybe big things, small things. And she said that there's a certain implausibility in the nominalist view, in the view that these categories are arbitrary. And that's always stuck with me. And I've always gone back to remind myself that there's something immediately plausible and meaningful about realism, where you understand the world in terms of real kinds which are really instantiated in the stuff around you. And I think one of the biggest goals of philosophy should be to find a way to cut nature at its joints, to figure out what actual natural kinds exist in the world and which natural kinds don't exist in the world, which kinds are just artificial kinds that we've imposed on things. And I think that is possible only within a sort of Platonic Aristotelian framework where you accept that there's real forms. That's the first step. And second, you start discovering what those real forms and what those real categories are. So in a sense, Aristotle has stuck with me all throughout metaphysics, because I've always been a realist about forms, and he's always been in the backdrop of that.
Very good answers, very good presentation, very good information. I'm going to ask one more time, is there anybody in the audience who has a question for Jigmo about Aristotle or philosophy? Okay, well, I would like to ask perhaps one last question to close this excellent presentation. And it's just a general question. What would you like the audience, not just the live audience, but the hundreds of people that will hear this on YouTube and BitChute, to take away from Aristotle, right? And from your introduction to Aristotle today, if they're only going to be able to retain, one thing or one closing sentiment, what would you like that to be?
I think the one sentiment, there's two things, but the first is more important. Look to simplify things. Many people unknowingly engage in metaphysical or ontological systems where they have far more entities than they need to explain experience and to explain real phenomena. Our goal should always be to simplify, because, and this is a very basic principle, let's say I have an answer to a question. The answer has two parts. Okay, there's two possible scenarios. There's two possible places where I could be wrong. An answer which has one part, there's only one place where I can be wrong. The simpler the better, the less entities the better. That should be your goal when you reason and understand the world. Second thing, though you could probably get by in trying to understand and make sense of modern philosophy without ever reading Aristotle or Plato or any of these guys. I mean, you hear them mentioned, but you don't really need them because a lot of their stuff is being regurgitated, simplified, reformed, made better sense of, whatever. It is always good to look back on the roots of things and understand that, quite frankly, a lot of the stuff that you're engaging now has a foundation which goes back thousands of years. And you would be surprised how many times we have found that stuff people said 4 centuries ago, 5 centuries ago, even 20 centuries ago, pops up as likely true in the modern age, and where we were mistaken about that being true for a whole century or even 2 centuries. So it's always good to know the past because, as the famous saying goes, knowing the mistakes of the past prevents you from making mistakes in the future, or knowing your history prevents you from being ignorant about how to make proper predictions. So I think A, simplify, B, know your history, be aware of what your roots are. If you do those two things, you're on your path to a proper engagement with not only philosophy, but with any academic discipline.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know, Jigmo is doing, or at least repeating, recurring philosophy podcast here with us on the roundtable. This was episode 3. We'll keep an eye on announcements for his upcoming events. Very educational material. I am very grateful for it, and I'll make sure you check out his last episodes. The first being Introduction to Analytical Philosophy, the second being Philosophical Zombies, very interesting concept. You can find that and all our other podcasts on YouTube, on BitChute, and in the RT podcast channel of the server. So we're going to wrap this up here. Fantastic material. Thank you all for attending. Please do join us tomorrow at 9 p.m. Central. I'm sorry, 8 p.m. Central for another great podcast. Currently slipping my mind what it is, but you can find it in the announcements channel. It will be announced. And make sure you join us on the Roundtable Discord server for those of you listening to this on our other platforms. Also, don't miss Wednesday at 10 p.m. Central, a very special late night podcast with my old friend, Dr. Weird. If you do not know him, you don't want to miss this, even if you do. He's a fascinating character, a mad scientist, intelligent and eccentric in the extreme. So, guys, let's all jump up to Roundtable 1. And remember, please do us a favor, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and BitChute. More subscribers helps us a lot. And you can always give us a thumbs up on this and all our other videos. That would be huge help as well. Please do consider donating to Zoo the Stormbird's GoFundMe. As you know, he was a victim of a robbery, already in a hard time, so we want to help him out as much as we can. And that's all for now, folks. Thanks so much. I'll see you upstairs. Roundtable 1. Much love. God bless.